Muy buenos días a todos nuestros oyentes en esta nueva presentación virtual del INCIPE, la penúltima de este curso y la primera tras la muy reciente e importantísima cumbre de la OTAN celebrada aquí en Madrid. Mr. Strubans, please allow me just a few words in Spanish. Hoy tenemos el gusto de tener con nosotros al señor Serge Strubans, director para Europa, para el norte de África y Oriente Medio del muy prestigioso Instituto para la Economía y la Paz, con sede en Bruselas. Este es un organismo que emite anualmente dos índices muy relevantes, el índice de paz global y el índice de terrorismo global. Ya lo hizo aquí en el año 2020 en dos sesiones distintas. Y por ello lo que nos cuente hoy, tras 2 años y tras los dos enormes cisnes negros que nos han acaecido desde entonces, la pandemia por un lado y la guerra de Ucrania por otro, es de gran interés. El señor Strubans, muchos años en activo en el ejército belga, ha sido funcionario de la NATO durante largos años y es hoy un importante conferenciante sobre temas de seguridad y desarme. Miembro de muy importantes centros de pensamiento como la Asociación del Tratado Atlántico o el Colegio Europeo de la OTAN. Es el fundador de la consultoría de seguridad estratégica SECUR y representa en Bruselas el Instituto de Economía y Paz, y ya citado. Déjenme pues agradecerle al señor y al citado Institute for Economics and Peace el que haya elegido al INCIPE para presentar aquí en España su informe anual. Un informe que también se está presentando y ha presentado estos días en distintas capitales europeas. Y ahora, unas muy breves palabras en inglés para darle la bienvenida a nuestro invitado, que nos va a hablar en inglés desde Bruselas. Very welcome, Mr. Strubans, to this INCIPE talk. I have just introduced you in Spanish to our Spanish audience. After your talk in INCIPE in 2020, it's an honor and a big pleasure to have you back here in Spain to present this year's Global Peace Index. So many dramatic events have happened since you came here and since last year that we all await your presentation with great interest. And without further ado, let me give the floor now to our Director General, to Professor Vicente Garrido, who will remind our audience on how this event will proceed. Then Vicente Garrido will give you the floor. So first of all, to you, Vicente.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Serge. It's an honor as Ambassador Alabar said to welcome you again here back in INCIPE to present once more the Global Peace Index that, as far as I remember, you have presented in INCIPE in the last 5 editions. Well, the procedure today doesn't differ from the one that we have been following during this year. Please post your questions to the YouTube chat, and then I will pick up all the questions and I will, at the end of the intervention of Serge, group all this, not necessarily by order of arrival, but by thematics. So, and my recommendation is not to wait until the very last moment of the event, because otherwise we will not have the time to formulate all your questions. So I would be grateful if you can formulate your question no later than 10 minutes before 1 o'clock, which is the time that will be the end of this presentation today. So Serge, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much to you, Ambassador Alabart, and to you, Director General Garrido, for such a nice introduction. And the honor is really shared on both sides in this collaboration. It's always a pleasure to use, or I would say to collaborate with INCIPE to share the results of our research in Madrid, in Spain. What I will do now is use a PowerPoint. I will share my screen and talk to you about 4 different things. First of all, I will concentrate a little bit on what happened or what is still happening in Ukraine and the impact that it already has had on the levels of peacefulness for the countries involved, but also for the region. After that, I will go into more generic results for a year-on-year evolution of the global peace index, but also trends over a larger period of time, 10 to 15 years, look at the evolution of peace over the past 1 to 2 decades. And finally, at the end, or eventually at the end of my presentation, I will definitely also speak about the cost of violence. And of course, if we could deviate or just take some part of this investment in violence and redirect it to development or initiatives, of course, this would be very good. I see that the slideshow is already on, so let's move forward. So first of all, a couple of words about the Institute for Economics and Peace. So we are an independent, apolitical, non-for-profit think tank, and what we do is measure and quantify peace and try to build a greater understanding of the key drivers of peace, but also of the I would say all the benefits that come along with a more peaceful situation. It's an Australian think tank, so the head office is located in Sydney, Australia. We have offices worldwide. I'm directing the one in Brussels, as it has been explained to you before. We are responsible for Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, in close coordination with the office in Southern Africa, really trying to be active in most of the countries of this continent. The same approach in the Americas, an main office in New York, close to the UN, collaborating with office in Mexico City, responsible for Central and Latin America. Why Mexico City? Because Mexico is the only country in which we produce a national peace index ranking the 32 Mexican states according to the levels of peacefulness. So what do? We address 3 types of audiences, and you can see there with the relative success. First of all, general audience. That's why also we are able to visualize and translate really in something that is really approachable statistics, making sure that we can inform a large audience on the results of our research. Of course, the academic world is part of is a second audience of ours, and third of all, policymakers and decision makers, making sure that they can make informed decisions. This is the 16th edition of the Global Peace Index. We rank one of the 63 countries on this index, but it is pretty close to 100% of the world population. We use 23 indicators, and they are all weighted on a scale from 1 to 5. We developed this ourselves, and we are guided by a panel of international experts. So you will see later on into the PowerPoint presentation that the software we are using, this platform to organize this webinar today, has changed a little bit some of the slides, but I will be able to explain to you the results of the Global Peace Index. So 23 indicators are grouped in 3 main baskets, 3 main approaches to measure peace. First of all, we look at the implication in ongoing domestic and international conflicts, so with the indicators that you can discover on the screen. The second measure is a measure of social safety and security, so really look inwards into our societies and how peaceful they are. And the third level of militarization, you will see that I will talk a lot about this third measure also during my presentation, is looking at measure of militarization with one positive indicator there, and that's the investment and participation in UN peacekeeping operations. So as promised, first a few words about the impact of the war in Ukraine on the index. First of all, what I would like to share with you is some research that we did in collaboration with Lloyd's of London in the past year. So this has been done between 2019 and 2021, so clearly before the conflict that started on 24th of February this year. So we asked a couple of questions worldwide, but of course here you can see the concentration on Ukraine and Russia also. So we asked the question if the Ukrainians were feeling safer today, or at the time we asked the question, than 5 years earlier. And you can clearly see there a very positive increase I would say, against the global average. So there was some form of optimism in Ukraine about, what happened in the past 5 years. And if we would continue to look at this, we also ask them, what are the top risks that you would identify as Ukrainians for your future situation today? And you can see there that war and terrorism, basically the use of violence into their societies, only came sixth as the potential risk to impact their livelihoods, with health-related issues, even without COVID-19, transportation, crime and violence, economy-related issue, and financial hardship being those five most important potential risk identified by the Ukrainians. So that's, I think, really remarkable. When you look at the optimism for the future, the life satisfaction optimism for the future, so basically the question was inverse and say, what about the next 5 years? Where will you be in the next 5 years? You see there a huge increase when it comes to this potential future optimism in Ukraine. So before the war, we were really looking at a society that was really optimistic about where they came from, the situation that they are in at that moment, and definitely with a positive outlook to the next five years. That's another very fascinating result there of this poll. We asked the Ukrainians what they would think about the capacity of the government to deal with a disaster, really a major issue. And as you can see, really low compared to the global average. Well, only 20% of the Ukrainians thought that a government would be able to deal with a disaster or a really critical situation. Well, I think there again, this I would say history have proven that the Ukrainians wrong when it came to this optimism. So clearly, a society that was not really expecting to end up in a situation they're in at the moment. So the direct impact of the war in Ukraine that we are already able to measure is clearly high level or rising inflation, supply chain shortages, rising food prices. And dear Ambassador, you spoke about the two main disaster, the two main crises that we have faced in the past 2-3 years. Well, those three things have already been generated or initiated by as an impact of the COVID crisis, and we see that the conflict in Ukraine basically is turbo boosting the effects that were already initiated by the COVID crisis, accelerating them and aggravating them. We see that some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa is really the part of the world, or one of the parts of the world, one of the regions most affected by different forms of violence. They're also most affected by terrorism, for example, in the global terrorism index that you mentioned. Well, we see that some of the countries over there already struggling with food insecurity and undernourishment have been historically reliant very well or very heavily on grain supplies from Russia and Ukraine. So they are going to be even more impacted than they were already are at the moment, or that they were before. You spoke about NATO and the very successful, well-organized summit last week in Madrid. So we have seen that NATO members have pledged to spend 2% of their GDP. Well, actually, in nominal worth, that would increase the military expenditure by 7%, which is really a fascinating number to see that on average about 80 to 85 billion euros would be invested more every year into the military, only for NATO countries that were already spending a lot doing so. We have also seen, and that's a confirmation, of course, of what happened in previous conflicts, is that social media and immediate coverage through cell phones are part and are a central part in the way intelligence is gathered. It is also shared instantaneously and of course with little analysis. So as a security expert and a former military, I would call this information or intelligence, because the analysis part is missing. The problem is that a lot of people are just like using this as intelligence, and it's unconfirmed. The facts are not checked and clearly unanalyzed, and therefore can impact also the way we are looking at the conflict and the way we analyze what's happening in Ukraine and in the world also. So there you see we are entering in a couple of slides with a couple of twists, but I will be able to explain what's on there. I already spoke about the military expenditure in NATO and the pledge for 2%. Well, we clearly see when you look at the right side, this is the evolution of military expenditure globally according to GDP. You can see there, and that's one of the main key results of this year Global Peace Index. Well, over a period of 15 years and more than 110 countries have reduced their investment in the military compared to or as a percentage of GDP. So that's the blue line, the blue graph on the right side of your screen. On the other end, on the red line on the left side of your screen is showing you the nominal worth of investment into the military. So basically, every US dollars that have been invested in the military, and there you clearly see an inverse trend. So as a percentage of GDP, the investment has reduced, but really, when we look at the dollars that has been invested in the military, you see a clear I would say increase, and especially a steep increase in the past years of this investment into the military. When we look at the global trends in the military expenditure, so the graph is showing you how this would evolve, but the graph is also showing you how it would evolve, or how it might evolve in the coming years if the NATO countries are really realizing the pledges to 2%. So if all NATO countries would invest 2%, as I said, this 7% increase in real budget, well, that's the way, or that's the direction the curve would take, really steep to the top. So this pledge of 2% is really going to impact the third, as I said to you before, the third family of indicators looking at militarization. That's the evolution for Europe. So you can clearly see that in 2016, and that's basically the year in which Europe decided, after President Trump had been elected as a US president, and where the request for Europe to start investing in its own security was really at the heart of the debate. Well, 2016 is the start of a lot of initiative at the level of the European Union, but also at the level of its members. It's also a year in which, and that's only 2 years after the annexation of Crimea, where a lot of European Union, but also NATO members realized the potential threat and started to reinvest into their military. So clearly, a change in 2016, but a steep increase in the investment in the military in Europe starting in 2020. And we can only imagine, this is going to continue to, I would say, climb exponentially if we go for 2% in GDP for all NATO members. Well, clearly, that is what would happen for Germany. So you clearly see in Germany also pledged an annual or one-shot 100 billion to be invested in their military. So clearly there you see those graphs being massively influenced by those pledges and those evolution. This is a graph showing you the evolution of the global food prices. So as you can see, a first effect of COVID-19, and a second effect, and really reinforced also by the war in Ukraine and the impact there on not only the production, but also the management, the storage, and the distribution of agricultural products, of grain products. So clearly, is there an exponential increase also in global food prices. Of course, this has a direct impact on undernourishment, and you see that higher food prices is just accelerating the rise in number of undernourished people. There again, in the past 2 to 3 years, this exponential I would say negative evolution in the number, so way higher numbers of people undernourished in the world. So this is just an idea to give you what the impact is of the war in Ukraine, and this is showing you the importance of the Black Sea and the ports, the Ukrainian ports, giving access to the Black Sea, the distribution of this resource. As I said before, targeted attacks on both production but also storage sites of grain in Ukraine, disruption of the lines of communication, no access to the harbors and the ports on the Black Sea, and of course some form of sea blockade in the Black Sea also, that is almost making it impossible for Ukraine at the moment to export any goods through the Black Sea. And of course this is disrupting, I would say, the global food supply chains in the world today. So enough about Ukraine at the moment. Let's shift to the key findings for the Global Peace Index this year. This is a map that we always produce every year with the indexes. It's available on our website, just as a report, and even the PowerPoint that I'm using, that's on our website. It's called visionofhumanity.org. You can access this map. You can click on each of the countries, access the data for each of the countries per region globally, And next to that, of course, in a visualization effort, you can already identify with a color code which countries and which regions are most impacted by violence in the world today, and which countries and regions are the most peaceful ones. Well, this year we saw an average level of global country peacefulness deteriorating by 0.3%. So that might sound marginal, 0.3%, but it is the 11th deterioration in the last 14 years. What we have seen, well, we are at the lowest level of peacefulness of the past 15 years, and we have also seen that 4 or more indicators, 4 of 23 indicators, are at the lowest level since inception of the Global Peace Index. We have seen over the last year that more countries became more peaceful than countries that deteriorate, and still we do have a deterioration. So this is showing us that it is really easy to slide into the violence trap, to slide into more violence. And when we look at countries doing so, we see that some of those countries can do that at a very high pace, sometimes with double digits percentage to do so. On the other hand, countries that are involved in trying to increase the levels of peacefulness, so those 90 countries, well, they also see that it's very difficult to do so. And when you do so, when you invest in a more peaceful society, well, you see that this is going very slow, and maybe some bits of a percent every year. So the difference there makes that even if you have more countries improved than deteriorating, you can still have a decrease in the levels of peacefulness. Well, the improvements last year have been driven by the terrorism impact. So this was the 7th year on record when we saw a decrease in the impact of terrorism. At the same time, we also saw a concentration, as I said before, of the problem in the Sahel region and sub-Saharan Africa. We have also seen, and that's a longer-term trend, incarceration rates going down. And as already explained to you, military expenditure as a percentage of GDP going down over a period of 15 years, and definitely also last year. Deteriorations were primarily driven by changes in the number of refugees and IDPs. So by the end of, so when we presented this Global Peace Index on 15th of June, and the data that we collected at the end of 2021, and I would say by the end of March 2022, in the index you will find back a figure that is around 88%, which is still double of the number a decade ago. So we doubled over, or even more than doubled over a decade, the number of refugees and IDPs, of course, generated by natural disasters and conflict. Well, today, especially when we look at the latest Global Trends report by UNHCR, we passed the cap, we passed the level of 100 million refugees and IDPs in the world. Of course, the extra 15 generated by conflict, with a concentration on the conflict in Ukraine. I think that's a terrible situation in which we are. We also seen that the political terror scale deteriorated, and also the good relations with neighboring countries, of course, for obvious reasons. Well, Iceland is still the most peaceful country in the world. Afghanistan is still the least peaceful country in the world. And well, there also we see some form of systemic interaction between a lot of strategic factors influencing peace and security. Afghanistan is at the bottom, really last country on both of peace indexes. So Global Peace Index looking at negative peace, which we defined as being the absence of violence or the fear of violence. But it's also the last country on a positive peace report looking at those attitudes, structures, and institutions in which you need to invest when you invest in positive peace to create more resilient societies, or more peaceful societies. So clearly there, when it comes to the peace indexes last, well, you will also find Afghanistan back on top of the two indexes that in which we focus on the impact. That would be the Global Terrorism Index. So Afghanistan is still today the country in which is most impacted by terrorism, but we also find it back in an ecological threat report that is looking at the interplay between the impact of ecological threats and the resilience of the countries to absorb those impacts. So we clearly see there a lot of those countries that are at the bottom of our peace indexes will also be on top of our indexes and reports looking at impact on societies. As I said to you before, the peace is at the lowest since inception, and it's down by more than 3%. So it's really worrisome to see that, and it's also a worse score since the inception of GPI on several indicators, such as political terror scale, political instability, neighboring country relations, refugees, IDPs. Over the same period of time, we have seen a very strong increase of social unrest in all societies. And when you open the news today, it's only confirmed because we see a lot of discontent and grievances throughout the world leading to demonstrations, and a lot of those demonstrations also turning violent at some point. The largest deterioration on the index this year is Ukraine. As I explained to you before, we closed data collection on the 31st of March, which allowed us to capture about 5 weeks of the conflict. And you still see that Ukraine is the biggest deterioration. So you just can imagine what the figures could be next year when we will have the full extent of the conflict being featured in the Global Peace Index. Russia today, or Russia as we produce the Global Peace Index this year, is the 4th least peaceful country in the world. As I explained to you before, we see inflation on the rise, the food crisis that is really there, supply chain issues, economic conditions. It's already bad today. It's just going to get worse as we move forward. Militarization improved last year, and that's for the last 14 years. One of the 13 countries improved, as I explained to you, when we look at the investment in militarization compared as a percentage of GDP. We also see that underlying measures of resilience are deteriorating. So we see high levels of corruption, we see much more group grievances, of course, leading to more social unrest. We see fractionalized elite, quality of information, of course, fueling political instability. As I said to you before, violent demonstrations deteriorate by 49% since 2008. We see that more than 120 countries decreased, or the worst score, only 23 improved. We also see that the global impact of violence is about 16.5 trillion, which is close to 11% of the global GDP. And I will give you more details about that later on. And of course, in a conflict or in a war like the one we see in Ukraine, but also other conflicts worldwide, it's very hard to identify a winner in this conflict. I think everybody's losing to the use of violence, everybody's losing to war, and definitely the people in these countries, but also globally and the economy globally. So this is top 10 of the Global Peace Index. As you can see, not really a lot of changes there. Iceland, New Zealand on 1 and 2 as usual. And then you see that after that, you will have quite a lot of small European liberal democracies that will fill the top 10 and the top 20. So not really a lot of evolution there, a lot of movement there. I would almost call them the same usual suspects when it comes to the lowest level of on the index. Clearly there, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Russia, South Sudan, Congo, Iraq, Somalia, Central African Republic, Sudan. A lot of countries already involved in conflict, external, internal, definitely impacted by high levels of violence and instability. Well, let's open a time window there. This is a confirmation of what I explained to you before. So only 3 small improvements over a period of 14 years. As you can see, as of 2014, a steep decrease in level of peacefulness, the lowest level since inception of the Global Peace Index, down 3.2% over this period of time. So it's really something to worry about. And as you can imagine, not really a lot of indicators, a lot of signs that are positive for the future. Over a period of 15 years, so we see that more countries deteriorated than increased. The levels of peacefulness, 3.2% since 2008. And as you can see, and it's well explained with the color code, but also the size of the histogram on this slide, it's much more easy to decrease your levels of peacefulness rather than to build up peace. When you look at the 3 different families of indicators that I spoke of before. So the blue line is showing you the security within our society. So that's quite stable. A very small deterioration of the past years. It's definitely conflict, and that's the red line that has impacted impacted the levels of peacefulness and has generated the decrease in the levels of peacefulness over the past 15 years. And the green line is showing you this evolution of militarization compared to as a percentage of GDP, and that's the only improvement that we have seen on the 3 families of indicators over the past 15 years. What we have also seen is this widening gap between the most and the least peaceful countries in the world. So it's only the most peaceful countries in the world that are successfully generating more peace. And it's, of course, those who are least peaceful who continue to fall and at a very fast pace into the violence trap, into conflict, into war and destabilization. So this is us going into the three families of indicators. So when we look at safety and security in our societies, so we see, as I explained to you before, the number of violent demonstrations that is really going up, going almost through the roof. Same thing for the number of refugees and IDPs. And as I said to you before, a trend on lower incarceration rates and homicide rates also worldwide. So that is the only positive sign here on this slide. When it comes to ongoing conflict, well, when you look at the internal external battle death, you will see that this is a form, or this graph is really starting to be very comparable to the impact of terrorism worldwide also. Why? Because we have seen that 97% of all terrorist attacks occur in conflict. Terrorism is a tactic and procedure that is used a lot in conflict also. We have seen that the number of internal conflicts fought and the intensity also of those conflicts have only been on the rise over the past 10 to 15 years. When it comes to trend in militarization, so we clearly see that the number of armed personnel, of course, as a rate about to the own population is going down. The military expenditure, when it comes to percentage of GDP, same thing. Weapon import export, we saw a change in trend in the past 2 to 3 years. Well, let's have a look at the economic value of peace, or the cost of violence. As I explained to you before, it's 16.5 trillion that has been invested in violence last year. So that's about 11% of the world GDP, or just above $2,000 per person participating in this webinar. So everybody that is there has spent about $2,000 on violence last year. Let's just imagine what you could do if you would reduce that by 1 or 10%. Well, if you reduce that by 1%, you can double. You would be able to double the global budget for overseas development aid. So all the development budgets from all governments in the world, you can double it if you would reduce that by 1%. If you would reduce that by 10%, this would be equivalent to the budget for foreign direct investment worldwide, or the size of 3 European economies, countries like Ireland, Denmark, and Switzerland, for example. So just imagine what you could do if you could reduce this cost of violence and re-inject it into positive projects worldwide. As I said before, I think we see there this 2,000 to 2,000 euros. The economic impact increased by 12.4%. Clearly increases in military expenditure, as I said, in nominal worth, or the amount of US dollars invested. We also see that in the 10 countries most affected by violence, the average cost of violence is 34% of GDP. So you can imagine, and that's an average for all countries involved in some form of destabilization, violence, or violent extremism. So when you spend close to 40% of your GDP to violence, there's no other priority in your budget, that's for sure. We see a clear difference in the 10 most peaceful countries. It's 10 times less. It's only 10%, 3.6%, and therefore a lot of money that you can invest in your own development, in your own development of your peacefulness in your country, but also in other regions. And as I said before, if every NATO nation would invest 2% of GDP, well, we would see a rise in military expenditure by 7%. The 16.5 trillion are distributed about 80% for violence containment. So it's about 47% in military expenditure, about 27% in, I would say, police forces, so internal security, and that's a growing percentage. That's really worrisome. About 8% in private military security and military company, clearly destabilizing, those countries, those regions that are on the bottom of the global peace index. So that's really worrisome. And as you can see there, or imagine there, it's only less than 20% is related to the direct impact of violence. So, the battle death, the suicides, the homicides, those kind of things, the violent crime, only 20%. So 80% of this budget, 16.5 trillion, is invested into I would say violence containment. And you see that this percentage is completely different depending on the region in which you live, or the region in which you count this cost of violence. Clearly there, when you look at South America, Central America and Caribbean, but also Sub-Saharan Africa, you see a larger portion that is related to the direct impact of violence compared to this violence containment. So clearly per region, you always also can identify a difference in the impact of violence. Well, that would be the end of my presentation of the results for this year. So just as, in a nutshell, the impact of Ukraine, so a clear deterioration of the levels of peacefulness right there. Russia, the fourth least peaceful country in the world, a decrease of 0.3% this year, but that's a continuation of a trend over the last 15 years. We are the lowest level of peacefulness since inception of the Global Peace Index, and we see that 4 and more of the indicators of the 23 indicators for the Global Peace Index are also at their lowest level since inception, and we don't really see positive signs for a better and more peaceful future. And as a last trend, clearly we have seen this amazing amount of money that is invested in the environment, and of course there also the outlook with this 2% NATO pledge, which would result in 7% increase in military expenditure. We could clearly see that this figure will only grow in the future, and therefore a lot of money that could not be reinvested in creating more peaceful societies. So for those who are interested in reading the full report, accessing this PowerPoint, the interactive map, or even a very informative 4-page briefing, everything is available on our website visionofhumanity.org, and of course you can follow us on social media. Thank you very much for your attention for this presentation, and I'm more than happy now to engage in a Q&A session. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Comprehensive presentation. I am sure that was not easy to concentrate the result of all the report in this reduced time that you had for give us the big picture about. The first question is related to one of the issues that you have referred to during your presentation, and it's defense investments. Mm-hmm. Since the Global Peace Index is closely related with the state's investment or investitions in defense, and assuming, as you already mentioned, that after the war in Ukraine, almost all states are more willing to invest more in defense in order to achieve the 2% of the GDP, how is going to impact this decision and the war in Ukraine in the peace vision, utopian vision of peace that it's reflected in the Global Peace Index?
Well, it's an excellent question. First of all, I would say that when you look at, that's why I showed the slide also, when you look at the nominal worth of investment, you clearly see there a strong investment over the past, I would say, 10 years and more. When you look at Europe since 2016, so the past 6 years, you see there also an increase in the nominal worth investment. So this is not only caused by the war in Ukraine. Of course, a lot of equipment is going to Ukraine now. And when you see, for example, the successive budget lines that are delivered by the US, for example, also the UK and other countries towards Ukraine, it's like billion after billion after billion going towards Ukraine. But that's only one part of the effect. The other effect is, of course, the change in global trends, the change in the global aspects of international relations. So we clearly shift over the past, let's say, 2 to 3 years from a more liberal approach to international relations based on collaboration towards a more realist approach to international relations. Of course, the use of force by realist actors like Russia and Ukraine is just a good example of this. So we changed from a collaborative world into a more competitive world, of course, generating some form of arms race, if we can use this term also. So there again, this trend is not new, especially when it comes to the nominal worth investment into the military and into the military potential. Now, I think we are about 4 months down into the conflict. We can clearly see the impact that it has had on the people of Ukraine, the infrastructure of Ukraine, I would say the stability in this region, the stability in Europe as such. And of course, there is like an open question there. The question, it's a moral question. So it's basically a question that you cannot really answer, I would say, in a very sensitive way. What if we would not have or what if the West would not have injected so many weapons into Ukraine? What will be also the mid and long-term effect of the weaponization of this part of the world, for this part of the world, but also for our own communities? I think we all remember, I'm calling in from Brussels, so I'm really well aware of this, that all the weapons that were used during the terrorist attacks in 2015 and 2016, both in Paris and in Brussels, all came from a former battleground in Europe, from the Western Balkans, from what happened down there. So all those weapons at some point will get back into our societies also. And the Flemish Institute for Peace located in Brussels did a remarkable analysis of this also. So that's a question: what will be the mid and long-term impact of this heavy distribution or heavy weaponizing of Ukraine, of course, to fight back an aggressor on its own soil? So that's a question that remains unanswered, and we will need to wait to see this mid and long-term evolution from there. Of course, there is another moral question that you can ask yourself. Well, if we would not, or if the West would not have kind of defend its own interest, and of course defend the interest of Ukraine by militarizing so much, of course we would imagine then what the results would have been, and it's of course a domination of Russia into Ukraine also, which also would have had a mid and long-term effect on the life of the livelihood of the Ukrainians and the infrastructure in Ukraine also. But it would have caused less, a lower number of casualty and a lower number of the destruction. At least we can imagine this. So I think, in a nutshell, or to long story short, there we need to come back to one of the lines that I said in my presentation: there is never anyone winning in a war as such, and not only on an economic level, but I think we are now 4 months down within the conflict. We can start to see some trends. We can start to ask ourselves questions, and we can also start to see the effects of measures that have been taken with regards to this conflict. And those measures could be, of course, economic sanctions, and the effect of those sanctions, but definitely also the investment in more military equipment being dropped into the conflict. And we see now that peace is very, very far away, especially with the combat or what's going on in eastern Ukraine. I think there are no conditions at the moment to get into peace negotiation or maybe a peace settlement and try to bring peace back to the conflict. So I think the conflict as it is might last for a longer time, and that's also something that we have seen throughout the past decade also in other conflicts, who were basically most of them internal conflicts, regional conflicts. Once the I would say regional powers or global powers got involved into those conflicts, where they lasted for longer, became more intense, and of course created more casualties. I think that's a trend that we need to look at.
Thank you. I will now pick up a question related to this first one. It wouldn't be a good idea to have a specific reference in the Global Peace Index to the efficiency of defense investments versus current deterrence, which is mostly the nominal objective of security?
I think that's also why we have it's an excellent question again, but it's also a question that is looking at much more than just the investments that are made. I think that's why I'm always pleased to present this index and explain that there are 23 different indicators, and especially when you look at militarization, we look at 7 different indicators. So we have, I think, a well-balanced approach. We look at the number of people working within the military compared to the global population, weapons imports and exports, of course, the budgets, the military budget, military expenditure. So we have a very well-rounded approach to this. This question of efficiency is basically at the heart of what IAP is doing also. I think we're not living in a utopic world. We understand that because of the fact that we are human and we live in society also, we will always need to have some form of I would say violence containment, but what we are advocating for is, of course, to see this percentage, this 80% there. I mean, we're advocating for the total budget to go down, and we definitely want to see the investment in violence containment going down also. what we are looking at here, it's a more systemic approach. So basically, in countries or regions where there are low levels of peace, and especially low levels of positive peace, we see that there are high levels of grievances, and that's also a trend that I've explained in my presentation. Therefore, these high levels of discontent and grievances can transform into violence in our societies, either destabilization and social unrest, but also some forms of conflict. Therefore, countries need to invest in violence to counter violence. Therefore, they can invest less into positive peace, and you create a vicious cycle. Well, you need to transform this into a virtuous cycle where, if you have higher levels of positive peace, you will have lower levels of grievances. Most of those grievances will not transform into violence. You can settle this by mediation, negotiation, or some form of conflict resolution. Therefore, you don't need to invest in violence to counter violence, and therefore you can reinvest into a positive peace, which is creating a virtuous cycle. Well, clearly what we are advocating for at the Institute for Economics and Peace is to invest in those virtuous cycles. We understand that you always need a basic level of violence containment, both in the military and in police. We are not saying, we're not advocating for zero police or zero military. I think this would be stupid. But what we are not advocating for, but what we are thinking of, is to find the right balance, balance of investment into those two budget lines. But those two budget lines are impacted by the way in which you organize your society, in which you organize a more peaceful society. So for us, there is a bottom line, there is a balance to find in the investment in police and military, but every dollar that is invested too much in those both aspects is a dollar that you cannot invest into the resilience and the development of your own society and the global society.
Thank you. I will merge now two questions closely related for the same topic. Regarding the war in Ukraine, it's going to displace the attention of the international community, the public opinion, on other ongoing conflicts. And since you mentioned that Afghanistan, according to the report, is the least peaceful country in the world, what are the global implications of the insecurity in Kabul?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question also, because it takes away the 100% attention on only one conflict in the world. And as you have seen over the past decade or 15 years, it's conflict that has been the motor of the degradations of the levels of peacefulness. That's absolutely right to say that although we are here in Europe very committed or very attentive to what's happening in Eastern Europe and this aggression to the Ukrainian people, well, violence is not reduced to Europe. Or extreme violence is not reduced to Europe, but it's really very, very active and very, very impactful in a lot of other parts of the world, which, by the way, before violence and conflict impacted them, were already way less resilient than Europe was when the conflict in Ukraine started there. So the starting conditions were completely different for other parts of the world. We see basically, when we look at the impact that's can be by terrorism, by conflict, by natural disaster, also the effect of these ecological threats that I spoke about before, we clearly see three zones of the world that are getting very, very impacted at the moment. That would be the MENA region, although we see some positive signs over there. We see less impact of terrorism also. We see some of the conflicts in the MENA region being less intense and producing less casualties than it was a couple of years ago, 4 to 5 years ago, but still the least peaceful region of the world. We see a concentration of all the negative impact in sub-Saharan Africa also, and I would say more in particular in the Sahel region. This is, of course, another point of interest, and we clearly see a continued destabilization in what we call South Asia countries like Afghanistan in the first place, but also Pakistan and neighboring countries. I think it's absolutely correct to say that we should not deviate 100% of our attention to Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine deserves our attention, but every conflict in the world deserves our attention, and also deserve the attention of the international community to try to find ways to come to a more peaceful settlement. So that's absolutely true. I think the figures that we have seen, and of course I mentioned Afghanistan also in the Global Terrorism Index, well, to be able to get to what I would call a successful insurgency in Afghanistan, we have seen an increase in the number of terrorist attacks in in Afghanistan to lead to the transition with the Taliban now being into power. Almost counterintuitively, we can see that the Taliban at the moment, after this successful insurgency, are of course not the rulers that you would expect or that you like to see in any country, but are creating some form of stability. And I know it's really counterintuitive, and I'm not advocating for the Taliban at all. But of course, when you come from a period of intense use of terrorism into something that is a little bit more peaceful afterwards, you can clearly see an improvement there of some level. So what we expect for the future editions of the Global Peace Index is to see that some of the conflict would becoming more intense, so those conflicts would have a larger impact on the levels of peacefulness of the countries involved there than it would have in Afghanistan. But still, I think, and that's very important for us in the analysis that we do, we realize that a country like Afghanistan is one of the least resilient countries in the world. So any internal or external shocks, and that can also be the earthquake of about one or 2 weeks ago, will have an enormous impact on this society because of the absence of resilience within those societies. And absence of resilience is the perfect fertile soil for further conflict and for further destabilization. I think that's something we really need to take into account, and we really need to continue to monitor also.
Thank you, Serge. Okay, let's go to Africa, because you mentioned already these threats coming from Africa. So the NATO's Madrid summit has made specific references to the threats coming from our south, such as, for instance, uncontrolled immigration or terrorism coming out of the Sahel. What is the weight of Africa or the specific problem arising out of this continent and on our perception of our global security?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, and of course, in my introduction, it has been said that I've worked at NATO also representing Belgium there in the military, or helping represent Belgian military committee. And I think NATO is doing a good job to do this kind of 360 security analysis or risk analysis, and identifying the different things or the different elements that could, of course, impact safety and security of the member states of the alliance. And clearly, there you see a combination of internal and external potential risk. Of course, when you look at internal risk, I spoke about civil unrest, I spoke about social unrest. These fractionalized elites, political instability. This is also impacting member states internally, but it's clear that it's the conflict that is being generated outside of the alliance borders, or the what we will call the territory of the alliance, that is going to create potential disruption or potential for conflict or negative influence to the alliance itself. And of course, when you go 360, you identify what's happening in Central Asia. You of course identify a potential competition, especially with the US being one of the leading members of the alliance, a competition with China, and a potential for conflict in the Indo-Pacific. If you get into you can clearly see some form of destabilization also in Central and Latin America, leading to migration over there. I think when you look at migration in the world, it's three main routes: two towards Europe, one from the south and from Africa to the north towards Europe, one coming from the east, so basically Central Asia to the west to Europe, and the third one is a migration route going south to north in the Americas, from South and Central America towards the United States and eventually Canada also. So clearly there, when you do the 360 analysis and when you look at the different reports that we produce, you can identify that the Sahel region is really the motor of destabilization in sub-Saharan Africa. But not only this. What I would like to say, and Director Garrido, you spoke about migration and terrorism. Well, those are consequences. There is a reason why terrorism is developing. There is a reason also why people have to move. People have to leave their country of origin. People are getting displaced. And those regions are multiple. It is, of course, conflict, but it's also the effect of the ecological threats that I spoke of before, and of course exacerbated by the effects of climate change. And that's exactly what we are looking at in our ecological threat report. We make the link there between the external impacts by ecological threats and the resilience of countries to deal with those external threats. We have identified there a very intimate relation between ecological threats or ecological degradation and levels of violence, levels of conflict. And this violence can, of course, crystallize into violent extremism, and that's the terrorism that we see in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa, concentration in the Sahel. I think we need to look at the root causes there, and of course, NATO could I would say absorb in such a way the consequences, which would be the impact of migration. Let's see what they can do about this, but definitely also the impact of violence and violent extremism at the southern door of Europe and southern door of the alliance also. But I think what is much more important there is to identify the real root causes, identify this lack of resilience, this lack of stability in a lot of countries in Africa. And of course, there again, all the indicators are very, very negative, because one of the drivers of this violence is access to resources such as food and water. We know that the resource water is decreasing fast, and the access to it is becoming more and more difficult. I explained in the Global Peace Next the problem with undernourishment, food prices, global destabilization because of this. And on top of this, you have a growing population. In the next 30 years, sub-Saharan Africa is on average going to almost double its population. Countries like Niger, for example, which are already in a very sheer situation today, are going to almost triple their population in the next 30 years. So you have already this, I would say, epicenter of the impact of terrorism, the epicenter of the impact of ecological threats, the epicenter of the use of violence, and that's only going to aggravate in the coming years. So there's a lot more there to do than just address the consequences of the destabilization of this region, and it's the reason why you need to address in a certain way the root causes, and that's definitely a lack of governance. I would say lack of positive peace, and look at the 8 different pillars of positive peace that we produce. What about corruption? What about governance? What about equitable distribution of resources? And you can go on over all the indicators, all the pillars of positive peace. So you need to create more peaceful societies instead of only addressing the consequences of destabilization. That could then be refugees, IDPs, migration, and the use of violent extremism.
Thank you, Serge. What about energy security and the impact of regional conflicts on energy security? How can energy insecurity lead to conflict? It's this variable also has been included in the Global Peace Index?
Well, that's an excellent question. First of all, before I start answering the question, I would like to say that, especially in the European Union, and we measure this into, we do also work on risk analysis and risk identification. We do that in collaboration with the research services of the European Parliament. It's called the Normandy Index. Why? Because it's a collaboration with Region Normandy and the World Peace Forum in Normandy, and we decided these three entities to work together to do some risk analysis. Well, for the European Union, but I will say globally, the indicator energy security or energy dependency or energy insecurity has been red for the past 20-25 years. This is not something and that's of course the security expert talking now. We have not discovered this 4 months ago. This indicator has been red for the past 20-25 years, and of course we know where those resources are. We know how much we need those resources also, and we know what impact crisis could have on the price of these resources. What I think is going to happen when you look at energy security, I think you need to look at both international or external conflicts and internal conflicts. Of course, access to the resource can generate tensions, can generate use of conflict, can generate maybe also some form of war, some form of conflict. I think we know that for a lot of the energy that we need to have, this energy is located to, at least the access to the energy is located to very volatile environments or environments that are really under pressure. When it comes to the resources that we would need for alternative energy or the use of alternative energy, we also see there that for a green and digital future, well, a lot of the resources that we need are already located in conflict, in countries that are already involved in conflict most of the time for the resource that is present, or this resource will be located under a very fragile and very necessary ecosystem. So there again, for the fossil energy, we do see a problem, but also for the green energy, and of course that's the future, we will need to find a solution there to access the resources that we will need to develop this green and digital future in a peaceful way. So clearly the access to the resource and the geopolitical or geostrategic tensions that this could generate, and it's not only energy. I mean, we see now with food, it's basically we use all the different tools, or some countries use all the different tools at their disposal to influence the system and also to influence, to maximize the interest, but also to influence the counterparts in conflict. On the other hand, we need to look also inside our societies and the destabilization that this is going to create. And there again, I would like to emphasize the fact that the war in Ukraine, or the more competitive world in which we live at the moment, it's just an exacerbation of what already has been initiated by the COVID crisis. Clearly, the supply chain problems, semiconductors, for example, access to specific resources, inflation, economic crises. This is going to have an impact on our society and people living in our society, and clearly start to even exacerbate a trend that already started 10, 15 years ago. And this is this increased social unrest. We are going to see more and more. We're going to see this trend that is going to increase, maybe accelerate. We're going to see more and more people that will have difficulties to live in our societies, or in the global society also. We will see a lot of people that will not really accept this anymore. While I'm trying to give you an answer, of course, I'm thinking of what happened in Sri Lanka in the past months, and not only in Sri Lanka, but that's really like really a good example of how this will impact our societies also. So yes, access to resource, access to, I would say, energy resources can generate competition, geopolitics, geostrategic competition, lead to conflict or insecurity, instability, but definitely we need to look inside our societies also at a continued accelerated trend of social unrest and violence into our societies. And that's not only in other parts of the world. This is a trend that also has hit us here in Europe also in the past 10 to 15 years.
If you agree, Serge, we are going to take maybe 10 minutes more to pick up not all the questions, but at least 3 more.
Absolutely. And I'm really pleased with the number of questions.
Thank you. Regarding Europe, important economic problems are very relevant today for the Europeans, for us Europeans, namely inflation, mainly due to the dramatic rise in energy products, and the lack of sufficient foodstuffs, and therefore also a rise in prices. What is the weight of these economic worries in your conclusions of the report?
Well, of course, this is going to have a weight, but first of all, I think we need to put things in perspectives. I think we still live in, when you look at Europe, it's still the most peaceful region of the world. Of course, impacted over the 10, 15 years by some internal movements. So we have seen that some indicators in both negative and positive peace have been decreasing in Europe also. And I think Europe is still also the most resilient region of the world. So when you compare the impact on Europe and compare the impact on other regions of the world, I think, yeah, we should put things in perspective. So that's, first of all, something we need to take into account. And I guess the second part of my question would relate to what I just answered before, is going to see some evolutions or some trends that we have seen over the past 10, 15 years. And of course, you can think about the yellow jackets in France, for example, where there was a movement that was really not agreeing with the French politics. Of course, from the basis, a social movement there that was really against the especially economic politics of President Macron in France. Well, we will see that the more people will get infected in their daily lives, of course, impacted by the economic impact, well, the more we will see destabilization, social unrest, demonstrations that will turn violent at some point. But still, to put that in perspective, I think the impact will be much larger in other regions of the world, but therefore it will not be unexisting in Europe. We will see this degradation in peace continue in Europe also, but still we need to put this in perspective with other regions of the world that were in a worse situation than us here in Europe before the crises, or I would say the permanent crises, such as the economic crisis, such as terrorism, such as COVID, and now the war in Ukraine. Well, other regions of the world were in a worse condition, especially the economic preconditions to absorb the shocks that we are experiencing at the moment were completely different in other parts of the world than they are today. And I think when you look also at or measurement of positive peace, that it can be used as a measurement of development, but also a measurement of resilience, where you will find the European countries still on top of this index also. So yes, we will be impacted. Yes, this will have an effect on the stability of our societies, definitely within Europe, but still we are the most peaceful region of the world and the most resilient region of the world also. So compared to the potential for exacerbated destabilization in other regions of the world, I think we will be able to manage this. We will have also the stability of our governments that will use the resilience that has been built up over the years to absorb those shocks and try to minimize the effects within our societies. But I can really imagine that somebody that has been impacted by COVID, not only maybe physically, economically, but also mentally, allow us to pay. I was in Lisbon last week. I saw fuel prices getting close to 2.5 euros per liter. Well, I guess this is going to generate a lot of social grievances and social unrest also. But still, we live in societies that should be able to cope with this type of impact.
Thank you, Serge. 3 questions. I know it's difficult to answer, but if you can answer each of these in 1 minute,
all right,
we will be very grateful.
All right.
I have even a question in Spanish that I'm going to translate in English. Look into the list of less secure countries that are included in your study. There is a concentration to some extent in Central Asia, Middle East, and Africa. But on the other side, there are some clues of tensions in the Pacific due to the systemic rivalry between China and NATO. What is your opinion about?
Well, clearly, when you look at the evolution, I think the Indo-Pacific might be a theater of operation, at least one region of the world where the opposition or the confrontation between China and the United States can play out or can play down in the coming years. I think the think tank I'm representing is Australians from Sydney in Australia. Well, you clearly see there that. I mean, the Australian government also feels the pressure there, being almost between both of them, and the Indo-Pacific as a region or as a potential region for this confrontation to happen has emerged in the past 12 to 18 months, where more and more people will look into this direction rather to look at the 3 other regions that you have identified that are still at the moment most impacted by conflict and violence, being Central or South Asia, the MENA region, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So clearly there we might see some form of some emergence of tensions in these regions for sure. But it's of course you see an actor, or you see actors from that region. I mean, the United States with the Pacific coast, China, being close to that also. It's a potential zone of influence. But I think we need to understand that we live in a global world, and the tensions that might arise down there, or the confrontation between global power, also have an effect on other conflicts. I mean, when you look at the conflict in Ukraine today, it's not a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It's something much larger, where global powers, both China and the United States, are involved in also. And that's what I tried to explain before. So when you look at conflicts throughout the world. Generally, when those regional and global actors become part of this, well, these conflicts last for longer and become now more intense. So yes, we could look at the Indo-Pacific as potentially being something that is going to be a center of attention or the center of the confrontation in the coming years. But we need to put this in a global perspective and see how these different aspects are systemically influencing each other and making some existing conflict maybe last for longer or more important than they should be.
Thank you, Serge, again. Speaking to the Spanish audiences, it is very logical that the audiences ask themselves about which is Spain's position in the current edition of the Global Peace Index. And can you answer also, can you explain us the evolution of Spain in relation with the previous editions?
Yeah, clearly. So we clearly see, I mean, when you look at Spain, I think I would like to look at Europe as such. As I said, Europe is the most peaceful region of the world. As you have seen in top 10, Europe is definitely developing as a potential, as I would say, when you look at the top 10, you see these liberal democracies, rather small countries. Well, when you look at that, you will see that when you look at the region Europe, you will always find back the European countries before the other countries. And I think that's really important to understand. So you will always have the small liberal democracies coming first, followed by the larger EU countries like France, for example, especially those countries with quite developed defense industry. And then on just behind this, you will find countries that are that are European countries, not EU countries. So clearly, there I'm looking at the countries of the Western Balkan, and we have Turkey that is within the basket of countries within Europe, and clearly there. Well, you see that this is going to be the last countries of the European basket. Now, when it comes to Spain, the overall ranking is 29, so this is clearly a very peaceful country. You have 3 positions higher than you were last year, so that's something that is really positive. When I look at the different, when you look at the three sectors, we clearly see that the overall score is positive. We clearly see that the levels of militarization, and that's again, as I explained, are going down. We don't really see a difference in ongoing conflict as compared to the previous years. We see a slight deterioration in safety and security. And when I look at the indicators that are really generating this, again, it's following the trend of other countries in Europe. It's the level of violent demonstrations. This indicator has decreased. The homicide rate decreased, basically became worse. So that's on red. The police rates, who have much more, so the number of policemen per 100,000 Spaniards has increased, and also the perception of criminality. So I would say that those are the indicators that are really red now for you, or year on year, that this is the evolution. And the last one is the weapons import. So clearly Spain is following the trend of other countries in Europe, but still 29 on the index, very peaceful country. And as I said, three positions higher on the index than the year before. And when we look at the degradations or the indicators that were red on the index, well, this is just following the European and global trends.
Thank you. And finally, your final assessment about are there any indicators for optimism? There is room for optimism still after the evaluation that you have conducted in your report?
Well, I think we, as a final assessment, of course, I said a lot of negative things in, while presenting the global peace index, which I think is normal when you have an index where a lot of the indicators, but definitely also the global levels of peacefulness are at the lowest since inception of the index. So it's very difficult to come up with something positive. As I explained to you, when you look at a broader perspective of the research that we do, and of course, when you look at the impact of the conflict in Ukraine on what the levels of peacefulness will have in the coming years, I don't think we will have a better index next year than the one for 2022. So that's something we need to look at. I think there is a positive note here, and that's maybe my final assessment. When you look outside of the global peace index, the global peace index is, as I explained, looking at negative peace. It's a snapshot. You collect the data. This is your ranking. The only way you can influence your ranking is investing in positive peace. Positive peace are the institutions, structures, and attitudes you need to put in place to create more peaceful societies. There, we have seen over the past decade an increase by 2.14%. So that is very good. The only region that did not increase the levels of positive peace was North America, so basically the United States. And when we look at these three categories there for positive peace, we see that the only I would say category will really decrease were the attitudes. Of course, this is showing some relation with the fact that social unrest is on the rise. So I think we know what the problems are. We know where we need to invest. We know that the attitudes need to change, and therefore efforts needs to be done. So there is a way to get out of this almost negative spiral of decreasing levels of peacefulness, is to invest more in positive peace, invest more into what is creating more peaceful societies, and realize that this investment is not only going to create more peaceful societies, but is also going to create a lot of benefits that come along with a more peaceful situation. High levels of peacefulness, high levels of well-being and happiness, better economic outcome really on all the economic indicators, better ESG indicators, also better resilience, and especially also ecological resilience. So I think it's a political change. I think it's an intention that needs to come from our societies, but also from our leaders, just to create a more peaceful world in the future. Of course, when you look at the indicators, when you look at this transformation of international relations, there is, of course, it's difficult to have an optimist outlook to the future, but still we need to continue. I think, the fact that I'm presenting this, the fact that the audience is reflecting about what is peace today, or can I create a more peaceful world, if everybody starts to think like this, if every incentive or every initiative to create a more peaceful world, well, we need to grasp every of these occasions, every of these opportunities, trying to make a more peaceful world and trying to change the trends, trying to influence the indicators positively. So we all have to invest in peace on a daily basis.
So thank you, Serge, and thank you to everybody for your active participation today. And well, we hope to see you again in the next edition, maybe in the Global Terrorism Index. And now let me give the floor to the Secretary General of INCIPE, Ambassador Manuel Arabar, to conclude, to close this session today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Serge. Thank you very much, Mr. Strubens, for this very timely and interesting presentation. Many of the facts you have outlined here today have been eye-openers, and I think that they give us food for thought. I have been very impressed by many of them, among them the fact what the Ukrainians thought of themselves in 2021, when war was a very low in the list of worries, and how that has unfortunately unfolded in 2022. I think we all cross our fingers. I know that you are not very optimistic what is going to come next year, but we have to cross our fingers and hope that your report in 2023 will be a little bit better. Of course, that is contingent, among many other things and factors, on whether we are able or not to end that war in Ukraine in the next year. I think we have 12 months ahead of us, and hopefully we will do all our best to end this war as soon as possible. So thanks a lot. That means that you are already invited to for next year, and we'll take you to task and see what has happened in this 2023. Thanks a lot, Mr. Strugent. Now let me just say a very few words in Spanish to announce our next talk. Muchas gracias, señor Strugent, por esta conferencia tan rica de datos sobre la situación actual de la paz en el mundo y también sobre esta última referencia al papel de España en su ranking global, ¿no? Simplemente quería anunciarles que nuestro próximo evento tendrá lugar este próximo 12 de julio, esta vez a las 10 de la mañana, no a las 12, a las 10. El embajador de Chequia en Madrid nos va a presentar las prioridades de la presidencia de su país para la Unión Europea en este segundo semestre, tras este primer semestre en el que, como saben ustedes, Francia ha sido el que ha llevado la voz cantante. O sea que hasta el próximo día 12, que tengan ustedes todos muy buen día y que no sufran demasiado por el calor y, como siempre, cuídense del maldito COVID. Hasta muy pronto. Gracias. Thank you very much, Serge.